Hi, I'm Penny Williams from Freshwater Habitats Trust, and in this video I'm going to spend around 20 minutes or so talking through the background, particularly the survey methods for the England Pond Count, which is a citizen science-led survey to find out how the number of ponds in England is changing. The reason the survey is important is because ponds are a critical habitat type, particularly for biodiversity. Our own research has shown that although individually ponds might look small and sometimes pretty insignificant, look at them together collectively and they turn out to be massively important. In fact, in most landscapes, ponds are the richest freshwater habitat and they have the most rare species. Slightly shockingly, they're usually much more important than larger habitats like rivers and lakes. We also know that ponds are a wonderful, essentially ecological engineering tool. So at a time when freshwater biodiversity is declining nationally and under threat from climate change, we've shown that adding new clean water ponds to landscapes can dramatically protect freshwater biodiversity across whole catchments. And that's one of the reasons why maintaining and indeed increasing the number of ponds is so important. The problem is that there have now been no surveys of ponds in Britain for 15 years. There have been surveys in the past, particularly undertaken as part of the Countryside Survey run by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and we've long been involved in the pond element of Countryside Survey. We wrote the most recent Countryside Survey Ponds report. And then back in 2007, there were an estimated 234,000 ponds in England, and the numbers were fortunately going up. But this is 15 years ago now, and we really have no idea what's happening to ponds at the moment. It's important that we do know so that the information can be fed into national policy and used to inform and change policy instruments like biodiversity net gain and agro-environment schemes to make sure that they're working effectively for ponds. And of course, it's that need to understand pond trends that is underlying the initiative to develop the England Pond Count. So the aim is to have a survey that provides regular, statistically robust data that can tell us if pond numbers in England are going up or down and how much they're changing. It's being undertaken as a partnership between Freshwater Habitats Trust and Natural England with the help of citizen scientist volunteers. And it forms part of the government's Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Programme, which is undoubtedly useful because it's ensuring that the data will feed into policy. In terms of design, the survey is made up of around 250 1-kilometre survey squares that are representative of England's national landscapes. And the squares will be surveyed every 5 years to provide this regular assessment of change. So let's look briefly at the sorts of ponds that the survey includes. The definition of a pond used in this and other surveys is a body of standing water between 25 metres square, that's quite a small area, 5 by 5 metres or 5 walking paces for most people, up to a maximum of 2 hectares in area, which is pretty large, about the size of 4 football pitches. And then there's a second part of the definition, standing waters which usually hold water for at least 4 months of the year. So they're not necessarily ponds that are fully permanent. Ponds are hugely varied. That's one of the lovely things about working on them. So the definition includes many pond types, not only across this wide size range, but both permanent and seasonal ponds, temporary ponds that dry up in summer, like the 2 photos on the top right there. It also includes upland and lowland ponds, clean, unfortunately also many polluted ponds, like the pond on the middle right covered in algae, and both man-made and natural water bodies. Okay, so now let's get on to the survey methods. And as a start, a bit of important housekeeping. If you're undertaking surveys, please do read the project health and safety information and make sure that you've carried out your own risk assessment so that you minimise risks to yourself and stay safe when you're out and about. When you sign up to the survey, you'll have been given your own 1-kilometre survey square and been emailed information which should include a map with the ponds thought to be present. information about landowners and landowner permissions, and a copy of the survey methods and the health and safety guidance. One of the important things to check before you go out is whether you need to contact landowners. We'll already have got landowner permission for you to survey your square, but some landowners also like to know when you're actually on site, so ask if you can quickly phone or text them, usually the day before or when you arrive on site, so that they know you're around. Sometimes you won't have permission to survey all areas of your square. Those areas will be greyed out on your map, so please don't enter them unless you need to cross them, and then only on public rights of way like roads or footpaths. And finally, the survey doesn't include areas of curtilage. That's areas like private houses, business premises, gardens. So even if they're not greyed out on your map, they're still not areas to survey. So for example, on the map below here, you can see a pond associated with a little house and a track leading up to it. So it's pretty obviously a dwelling of some sort, and you wouldn't survey the pond in this area. But that'll be doubly clear for you because all of the known survey ponds will be numbered, and in this case, that one wouldn't be. So to undertake the survey, there are three main parts. Visiting each of the numbered ponds on your map to see if it's still there, searching other areas of your 1 kilometre square where you have permission to see if there are any new ponds that have been created, or you can find any older ponds that have been missed from the map, and then recording this information either on the project app or on the paper forms, and then later entering it online. To find your way around your square, you can either download the Pond Count app on your phone, or you can use the paper maps that we provide. And of course, you can always supplement this with your own paper or online OS maps if you have them. We want you to be able to spend your survey time as effectively as possible in the field. So before you get your map, we've looked at the Ordnance Survey map and satellite images of your square and identified as many ponds as possible. These ponds are marked with a number on your paper map or a symbol on the project app. And the format of the number on the recording sheet is always going to be the OS coordinates for your grid square, which in this case is TF6821, followed by a dash, and then the pond number, so pond 1 in this case. The issue with the map that we send you is that it's quite likely not to be very accurate, and that of course is really why your ground survey is so important. OS maps are often wrong, and it's not easy to tell necessarily if a pond is present even from satellite photos. Woodland and scrub are particularly tricky areas because the ponds get hidden under trees. So, for example, on the top right here is an OS map of Bagley Wood near Oxford, and the red circle shows the location of a pond that I visit regularly, but it's not marked on the OS map at all, and you can see that it's not actually visible on the satellite image below either, and that's pretty common. So if you have wood or scrub in your square, it's usually worth spending more time searching those areas than anywhere else. But there are also other situations where the OS just misses ponds. So here's an example from Brown Heath in Cheshire. If you look at the aerial photographs at the top, you can see that here there's a little pond clearly shown, but it's not present at all on the OS map. Over here, there's this area of rather indeterminate ground, which if you look at the aerial photos, here's clearly a little pond, and then this area of woodland that could be a pond. You can't really tell without a ground survey. Here, an example of a pond that's on the OS map and also on the aerial photography. Here, indeterminate ground, clearly a pond on the aerial photographs. And finally here, there's a pond which again is shown on both. It's rather a little turbid pond, very silty, probably because of fish or cows grazing. But over here, you can see there's what could be a temporary pond. You'd have to go and find out to be sure, but again, it's shown as an indeterminate area on the OS maps. So here's a good example of an OS map showing 3 ponds when the true number is probably somewhere between 6 and 8, and you'd have to do a ground survey to find out. Okay, so on to actually recording your ponds. In most cases, you'll arrive at a pond shown on the map and find that that pond is still there. You then simply need to update the record for that pond. So on the paper survey form, you show that the pond is present by adding a Y for yes, and on the app, you just tick the yes box. The only other thing to do at every pond is check its size. This is information that will eventually be used to see if the proportion of ponds in England in different size groups is changing. In the field, it's usually quick to do because the ponds only need to be placed in one of these 4 area categories and we've already made estimates. So really it's a matter of briefly checking if the outer edge of the pond looks similar to the map outline, and if it does, it should be in the right area category. If it looks really different to the map and you think it falls into another size category, then just change it to correct the category in the column on the right. And then that's it. You finish the survey for that pond and you can move on. If you rock up to a pond that's marked on the map and it's not there, then you record that pond as N for not present. And then it's also helpful if you can possibly provide a reason that you think it's not there. For example, it might have been filled in which case you choose option 4 on the list on the right, or it might be that it wasn't a pond at all. For example, it might turn out just to be a widened section of ditch, in which case you can choose option 1, which is feature was not a pond in the first place. Of course, it may not be at all clear why there's no pond, and that's fine. You just record it as code 9 for unknown. Occasionally, you might find that it's just too hard to access a pond. Ponds do often seem to be surrounded by prickly scrub or on the other side of impenetrably deep ditches. And if this is the case, if you can at least see the pond from a distance, then that's fine. You can mark it down as present. But if you just can't get close enough, no worries, mark the pond down on your field sheet as U for unable to survey. During your survey, you're quite likely to discover ponds that don't appear on the map. This might be because it's a pond that's been newly created, or equally, it may well be just because it's been missed before. If you're using the project app, then you can add the location of the new pond to the map by clicking on it, and it'll automatically provide you with a grid reference and a pond number, and it'll open a dialog box to provide further details. If you're recording on paper, you add a new number for the pond so that you can see here on the sheet that this square previously had 7 known ponds, so your new pond will be pond 8. And then you also add new for new pond. It's also obviously important to identify where the pond is for when you later enter it online. You can mark up your map in whichever way you want, with a dot or a cross or an outline, but because it's easy to get the exact location wrong when you're in the field, it's important to try and provide a grid reference too, either from an Ordnance Survey map or better still, using a GPS. I use one of the free GPS phone apps, though it's always important to remember that it'll be giving you a grid reference for where you're standing rather than where the pond is. Grid references in general should use the standard number and letter format. And if you're using paper maps and out of practice, then there's a guide on our website. If you can, it's useful to have your thoughts about why the pond has been missed before. So for example, it might be a new pond, which would be code 4, or it might be a seasonal pond that was marked on the OS as an area of marsh, which would be coded 2. Pond was misidentified as another habitat type. But if the reason's not clear, that's fine. Just record 4 for reason not clear. And finally, because it's a new pond, you need to put it in one of the 4 area categories. Most ponds will fall into the smallest size category because if it's larger, it'll usually have been picked up from satellite images. So mostly you'll be looking to see if your new pond is bigger than the minimum size limit of 25 meters squared, which is about the size of this little pond here, about 5 by 5 meters. Or whether it's close to the upper boundary between categories 1 and 2, which is set at 400 meters square. And the simplest way to do this in the field is by pacing. So most people's stride is between 0.8 and 1 metre long. I'm 5'6", my normal pace is 0.8 metres, so for me every 12 paces is 10 metres length. But if you're taller, most people just use 1 metre strides. And the final thing to note is when you're measuring the area of a pond, you should be looking at the outer edge of the pond, not just the water level, because the water level obviously is a transitory thing that goes up and down a lot during the year. If you're unsure where the outer boundary is, it helps to think about it as the pond's high water mark, the level that water would usually sit at when the pond is full in late winter or spring. And that level is often marked as a break of slope around the outer pond edge. But it should also be clear by looking at vegetation. It'll be where the pond's vegetation transitions from wetland to dry ground, and that'll very commonly be marked by a ring of rushes at the outer edge of a pond. So here you can see this outer ring of rushes marking the edge. Up here the foreground's got bulrush, but there's a rush ring around the edge here, and in this bottom slide, which looks like it's going to be a temporary pond, it's the outer ring of rushes here. One of the things that you may come across in your survey is ponds that are either merged or separated compared to the map image, and there's a convention for dealing with this. So if you have a pond on the map that's really two ponds, say it's the pond on the first row of this table, then it's the larger pond that retains the original pond number and grid reference, and the smaller pond is treated as a new pond and given a new pond number and a new grid reference, as on the last row. If it's the opposite, and two or more ponds perhaps are really merged into one, then as shown in the second and third rows, it's the largest pond that retains the original pond number, and the smaller pond in this case is recorded as N for not present. In both cases, it's worth checking if any of the ponds have changed size category during this process, and you can explain what's happened to the ponds using the codes in the last two columns of the table. So for example, if you're splitting a pond and adding a new pond to the survey, you can choose option 3 in the N column, which is that a single pond on the map is really two or more ponds. A more ambiguous situation is when you get ponds linked by a channel, and it's tricky to decide if that's one pond or two. Then the best thing is to consider what would these ponds look like if they were full of water in winter. And then if you think they'd only be joined by a narrow channel, then it's probably worth making them into two separate water bodies. But to be honest, it's often a judgment call with no right answer, so really it's your call. Another call you may need to make, particularly with new ponds, is when that pond lies on the square boundary. And then the convention is that if most of the pond is lying within your square, then you include it in your survey. But if, as occasionally happens, it's about 50-50 each side, then it's up to you. This last section is about distinguishing ponds from other habitat types, which can sometimes be surprisingly tricky. The most usual situation is when you're surveying in summer and trying to decide if something's a temporary pond or just dry ground. And that's quite common because depending on the weather for that year, between around 40 and 60% of all ponds can dry up in summer. If you're surveying in winter, there's sometimes the opposite problem. After rain, every little hollow can get flooded with water, and you don't necessarily know if it's a pond or not. In both cases, the things to look out for in temporary ponds are, firstly, the classic basin shape of a pond, and then particularly the presence of any wetland plants, especially, as we've seen in earlier slides, a fringe of rushes around the edge of a basin. And also have a look at the mud. If there's bare mud close to the centre of a depression, it's usually a sign that it's a dry pond. And quite frequently, a dry pond base will show evidence that it's recently held water, particularly if there's grazing, and you can often see poached hoof prints embedded in the mud or amongst the marginal grasses. If you're surveying in winter, You'd also be looking to see if the base of a water-filled depression that you come across has soft accumulated sediments, suggesting that the water's been standing for quite a long time, or alternatively, if the ground's quite hard, suggesting that it's not an area that's regularly been flooded. And if you have real problems with temporary ponds, and to be honest, sometimes we all do have real problems, then it's fair enough just to record the issues as notes on your field sheet or the app, and it may be that the feature will become much clearer during future surveys of your square in years when the weather may be very different. A final few issues that you may come across. You may find lengths of standing water that could either be a short ditch or could be a long pond. If so, have a look at the length and the width, and the rule of thumb is that if it's more than 20 times longer than it's wide, then it's a ditch. If it's shorter and fatter than that, then it's a pond. Similarly, sometimes you come across areas of widened streams and ditches, and it's hard to decide if that widened section is just part of the stream or if it's an on-stream pond. And the rule there is that you count it as a pond if the width of the ponded area is more than 15 times the width of the inflow and outflow stream. So, for example, if the stream's 1 metre wide, then the ponded area would need to be at least 15 metre wide for it to count as a pond. And last of all, there can sometimes be difficulties distinguishing between ponds and other areas of flooded wet ground like marsh or fens or wet woodland. And the best distinction here is really that with ponds you're looking for a deeper basin-shaped depression rather than extensive areas of flatter flooded ground. But to be honest, there are no true boundaries between any wetland type, and it's often a very fine distinction that you'll be making. So if it is proving tricky, trust your own judgment. Don't worry, and note down any problems that you have on your field sheet or the app, and they can be picked up in other years. So that's it for this methods presentation. We hope that when you go out, you very much enjoy your pond surveys and find them interesting. If you do have any problems at all, just contact us. And of course, don't forget to send in the data afterwards, even if you can't completely finish everything. So from all of us, thanks enormously for contributing to the England Pond Count, and very good luck with your survey.